Sorry about that. I just got cut off here. So scaffolding. I believe we talked about this a little bit in a previous class, but if not, here it is again. Scaffolding is the idea that we are going to teach in like basically sections. Think of staircases. We're going to teach what the child is capable here, and then we're going to up it just a little bit and teach them a little bit more. And then we're going to up it just a little bit more and teach them more. And then we're going to up it just a little bit more and teach them more. So, in this class, I'm going to scaffold you. I'm going to teach you a little bit at a time, and hopefully everything's going to build on top of each other until we can get the whole picture of life and human development. When you teach a child how to read, you scaffold them. You don't just give them a book with words and say, go read. You teach them the sounds that letters make. You teach them the letters. You teach them the sounds that they make. You put those sounds together and make small words, and then you teach them how to recognize those words, and you scaffold them throughout the process of reading. Zonoproximal development. This is important. It has implications for you as you do assessment and treatment with a client, because you need to know why they're in your office, what their issues are, and whether their needs are realistic or so you need to know what a good way of putting zonoproximal development is what is capable, what is possible for that particular client. So theory of mind, knowing that toddlers have thoughts, beliefs, preferences, and desires. You can look to Belsky on page 168 further for that. Gardner's 8 intelligences. I want you guys to know those 8 different ones. Logical, mathematical, musical, spatial, body kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. No kid fits in just one category. But remember, it's helpful to know what is your style of learning and what is recognizing what in another child's style of learning is, especially if you do go into treating children, recognizing how they're going to learn best. Kids don't tend to learn just sitting on the couch, and you got to get up and move and play around. So helping them figuring out what's their style of learning, and then using that and teaching the parents how to use that too. Know the term reversibility on Belsky, page 149. I'm going to skip over it right now. Centering, it's pre-operational versus decentering is concrete. And you can look that up more on Belsky on page 149 also. Egocentrism. So remember that when children are little, it's absolutely normal and natural for them to be egocentric. We want them to be. It's actually concerning if they are not. It's the inability to understand and that others have different points of view. So we don't want a child in these toddler years to have a concept of understanding other people's point of view. That would be concerning, because that would mean that they are growing up at a faster rate than they should. They're maturing beyond what they should be at this point in time. Emotional regulation, it's a concept that we can have emotions and remain calm or regulate ourselves back to calm. And children, it's not going to be perfect. They're not going to have the skills to do that every time. And adults, we don't have the skills to do that all the time. But we want to be able to start to teach children how to do these skills, and how to have these skills and how to use them effectively. So externalizing tendencies versus internalizing tendencies. It's the concept of you are the problem or I am the problem. When you think of an externalizing tendency, think of people who are always blaming everything on everyone else. They're very much the victims. These are also tend to be the bullies. Versus internalizing problems. These are the kids that are very quiet, very to themselves, very pulled in a sense, and they tend to think that everything was their fault. This is something that I want you to kind of be able to assess for when you're working with kids and doing the projects is, does the person have internalizing or externalizing tendencies, because it's going to change how you do treatment with them. Know the basic concepts of self-esteem, self-awareness, and learned helplessness. Know the concepts of rough and tumble play and fantasy play. In this stage, collaborative pretend play at 3 years old, that begins to start to happen where they're not just playing side by side, but they're actually playing with other children. Again, it's not going to happen perfectly, but it's going to start to happen about that time. Also know the concept of hostile attributional bias. So seeing benign situations as threats. Look at Belsky, page 186 for that a little bit further. Okay, I also want you to, I don't think we used this concept last week when we talked about attachment, but I want you to remember that attachment creates an IWM, an internal working model. And when you're thinking about attachment in children, I want you to be thinking about what kind of IWM has this child created? What kind of model, what kind of internal working model has this child, has this family created for this child, and this child created as to how they see the world. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit further and go into, I want you to also be able to know the different parenting styles of permissive, authoritarian, and authoritative. Remember that permissive is, there's very little boundaries. There's too much letting the child dictate things. Authoritarian, let me go to authoritative. Authoritative is going to be dictating more that militaristic perspective. And authoritarian is more of that rounded out. There's boundaries, but there's also leeway. It's not very rigid. So know those three different parenting styles. I also want you guys to understand the concept of boundaries for kids and why it is important. So I want you to just think, pause this video for a second and just think, why are boundaries important for children? What good does it do for kids? And once you think about that, go ahead and keep it going. So boundaries are really important for kids because it does a couple of things. It helps us set the boundary that I am parent and I'm in charge. It helps us set a boundary of this is how I can protect you and keep you safe. It helps the child understand the push and pull dynamic of staying safe and also kind of testing limits of what happens when I go outside the limits. So it's good cause and effect kind of learning. And then it's also really good for kids to kind of be scaffolded. As you are little, the boundaries are pretty right here, pretty narrow. And then as you grow, the boundaries get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's a great scaffolding process for kids to have these boundaries. It helps them feel safe. It helps them feel secure. But the boundaries, when they become law, when they become rigid, then they lose the good and the genuineness of boundaries. So it kind of goes back to the different parenting styles, permissive versus authoritarian versus authoritative. So when you think of promoting realistic self-esteem in children, we want to think about self-efficacy. The feeling that I can succeed. So when you think about that, that's when scaffolding and zone of proximal development comes in really handy, because knowing, what is that child capable of? What's their zone of proximal development? And then how do I scaffold them to be able to succeed? If we're setting a child up for an activity or assignment where there's no way they're going to be capable of doing it, then we're not building that child's self-efficacy. We're not helping them learn how they can succeed in life and they can build positive self-esteem. We're just setting them up for failure, which that does no one any good. So we want to think in terms of not what do I think this child should be capable of, but what is this child actually capable of. If I think that they should be capable of this, but they're actually capable of this, then we're going to start over here. We're going to scaffold, 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 scaffold. Yay, they got there. Now we're going to keep scaffolding to where we want them to go. But we got to keep in mind too, is this should a realistic should, or is it something that's really not realistic for this kid at all? Sometimes maybe kids should be over here, but we really get them over here. This is a lot of what therapy is. And so we do need to recognize they're here and get them over here. Whereas other times there's this should that they should be right here, when reality is this kid's never going to be capable of that and they need to be over here. So let's kind of keep that all in mind too. Empathy versus sympathy. Make sure you know the difference between that. Empathy meaning I feel and I can connect with your feelings. Sympathy meaning I cannot feel that, but I feel for you. So when we go back, let me go back to self-efficacy for a second. When we think about praising kids, we want to think about praising for acting rather than worth. So let me give you an example. So an example would be you did a great job helping clean up the toys versus you are a great helper. Think about the difference between those two for a second. You are a great helper is praising them for their worth versus you did a great job cleaning up the toys is praising them for their action. I can understand why someone might want to praise for worth, but what happens is then if that child ever is not able to, let me do another example, it's a little easier to understand. You're so intelligent versus you studied so hard for that exam. When that child takes a class where they get a C or a D or F, now they start questioning their worth, their value, their intelligence, which goes to their worth and their value versus their ability to study and prepare for that class. If you praise them for your ability to study and prepare for the class, then when it doesn't go so well, they can kind of go back to what could I have done to study and prepare better versus I'm no longer smart because I failed in this class. Make sense? If you don't understand that concept, make sure to ask me questions because that's a really important concept, especially as we talk about working with parents. Okay, so the last thing I want you to pause and think about for a second here is, what kind of things would you want to look for in a preschool? Knowing what we know about development of children in these years, in the play years, what kind of preschool would you want to be looking for? So pause for a second and think about that, and hold those thoughts because we'll get to them in a second. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I'm out of time and need to get going here, but I'm going to give you some more information in another video and then give you your assignment for makeup. See you later. Bye.